From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Ahead today, K-State's Dan O'Brien on the grain markets. He'll discuss this week's rally in the wheat market, fueled in part by serious concerns about the state of the winter wheat crop in the central and southern plains. And he'll talk about the latest corn-to-soybean price ratio, how that's leading to more aggressive bids for corn locally. Also, K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz talks about the merits of applying a starter fertilizer to soybeans at planting time, the accent there on phosphorus and potassium needs. He'll also offer his input on limited situations where soybeans might benefit from a starter application of nitrogen. And waiting to talk Kansas agricultural weather with us, K-State's Chip Redmond. All that here on Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. This Friday edition gets going with a glance to the grain markets, and standing by, as always, grain market economist Dan O'Brien, K-State Research and Extension. We've, again, loads to discuss here, Dan, but let's start with the lead dog in the markets this week, and that would be the wheat trade. Multiple factors are coalescing here, to put it that way, to strengthen these wheat prices impressively.
Yes, in spite of a weak export performance, which is probably going to cause the USDA to have to make adjustments. What that in a normal situation would be viewed bearish on the supply-demand balance sheet. This will be in the next WASDE report coming out next Thursday on the 12th. In spite of that, the news on the production side here in the U.S. and also overseas in India, those things are working together to provide all that much more support for wheat. I've seen it the last couple of days in the wheat market. We were up 30-some cents 2 days ago, and here yesterday closed up, May, which is going off the board, closed at 53. July, now effectively the lead contract, up 53 3/4 cents. So strong performance in the wheat markets. And when we look at the percent of winter wheat area that's in drought, comes to about 69%. So in essence, soft red winter in the Eastern Corn Belt, not affected, but hard red winter, white winter wheat, both affected sharply by this situation that we're in. And we're in a circumstance where news out of India that they have, again, after 5 years, strong crops, now they're dry and are basically coming to the market making reassuring statements that, no, we're not going to cut off exports. And in a normal year, maybe that wouldn't be that much of a deal. But with, again, real questions about what we'll be able to get out of Ukraine in terms of exportable wheat supplies, and that combined with worries about where we'll end up out of our hard red winter wheat and white winter wheat crops, you bring those things together, and the wheat market, it's gone up 80 cents in the last couple complete days. So what a situation. I would say cash prices for wheat, almost every bid in the 6 areas that we follow in the state are all at or above $11. Strongest bids at Salina, again, export oriented, about $11.50 in terms of the spot price. On the low side, we're at $10.87 in southeast Kansas, and everything else is above 11 at the major terminals that we're looking at. New crop bids, and then that's an issue now. We're close enough to harvest, and some areas have got enough rain and moisture that they feel pretty decent about it. New crop bids, interesting, again, Saline area, $11.70. The new crop bid's higher than the spot bid. Topeka, the spot bid, new crop bid are the same, $11.52. You go to Hutchinson, South Central, again, $11.15 new crop bid there in June, July, and we're at $11.09 now. So at those export-oriented areas, export terminals, strong new crop bids, they're sending the signal that they're really wanting to secure supplies to do whatever export business they can in coming months.
Just a quick note here on wheat. We are 2 weeks out from the Wheat Quality Council's 2022 Hard Winter Wheat Tour of Kansas and parts of surrounding states. You mentioned the Oklahoma and Texas reports coming in. The Kansas part of that tour may be shaping up, Dan, as potentially quite the market trigger.
Certainly seems that way. Again, the shortfalls that are being reported out of Texas and Oklahoma in the last week are pretty startling. Again, somewhere around 50 million, 55 or so out of Oklahoma. They'd had over 100 million last year. And Texas being really short also, it really puts the onus of the impetus on whatever can come out of Kansas to make up some of that difference. And again, recent rains we've had may help a bunch, but you look at the drought monitor maps, and still the southwest corner of the state still has areas that don't look very good. So perhaps we'll be blessed, and the recent rainfall will don't want to say bail us out, but it will help enough to not have the worst case scenarios come. Again, how much damage has that crop already suffered? How many tillers are there to be able to respond? How much subsoil is there to help bring that thing to the end? We turn hot again with stress on a crop that was already just barely hanging on out to the west, and where do you go?
Yeah.
So quite the situation.
On the corn side then, once more, favorable factors coming together here, and we see a surge in corn exports coupled with worries about planting delays in the Corn Belt this week.
You stand back and look at that and try to get the big picture, and the second corn crop in Brazil has suffered enough from dry conditions that you have private analysts coming in with numbers that are about 10 million metric tons below the USDA's projection of 114. And if the dry conditions continue, it could get worse. So you have that combined with excess moisture, delayed planting in parts of the U.S. Corn Belt, particularly northern plains, and you just have worries coming into the market. You and I talked about this before we came on air, but when you look at the new crop November soybeans at $14.91 and 3/4 on yesterday's close, and D's corn at $7.38, look at that ratio, it's 2.02. So in these areas where we have delayed planting of corn, it's going to make it all that much easier to possibly look at the strong soybean prices and say, well, hey, if I can't plant this, that's still there. But by the ratio of November beans to D's corn, that the market is trying to encourage people to plant corn. But still, if there's any hiccup, there's not a lot lost financially with prices that we're seeing for soybeans to go that way too. So I think that's some of what's being wrestled with right now. And that set of dry conditions down in South America helped to lead to exports for the week ending April 28th of about 75 million bushels for that week. So we're sitting at shipments and purchases of about just under 2.3 billion bushels. USDA's projections for 2.5 for this marketing year. So that's about 92% of the way the USDA's projection. We're only about 65% of the way through the marketing year. Again, coming back and having to ask the question, will the USDA see this pace of corn exports and raise that 2.5 billion projection that they've got and cut down the estimate of ending stocks we have for this old crop marketing year and raise the stakes for the new one? I should say, by the way, in this May 12th report, that we will be seeing the USDA's first WASD estimate for the 2022-23 marketing year. And again, that, we may get whatever we get, but the more we cut down those ending stocks out of this old crop marketing year, the smaller the beginning stocks are and the more pressure is on trying to avoid having a type of shortfall in the U.S. crop this summer. And again, it just adds to the prospects for volatile markets that we would see coming through the summer.
And as you referred, soybean market motoring right along, exports moving briskly and reliably.
Yeah, for soybeans, we had about a so-so week in terms of actual shipments of exports for soybeans, about just under 21 million bushels. That's just about essentially equal to what we need to meet the USDA's projection. But the forward purchases are what catch your eye. So the actual sales and forward purchases for this current marketing year ending August 31st is about 2.14 billion bushels, and the USDA projected 2.11. So we already have shipments and forward purchases over what the USDA is projected, and probably going to lead to, again, raising the export number that the USDA has and lowering ending stocks for the old crop year. But we also have already seen purchases of about 410 million bushels in the next marketing year. And that's about 19% of the USDA's projection that they had coming out of the the Ag Outlook Conference. So anyway, I guess hard to mask my concern about how these numbers are working out and where they take us this summer as we are balancing pretty strong demand for U.S. corn, grain sorghum, soybeans with any hint of production problems we may have here in this country in coming months. And it just would seem that we're set up to have a lot of support for grain prices, at least until the time we get in the middle of the summer. And when we normally see prices start to decline into harvest, I don't know that we'll see that decline this year. I think there's so many concerns overseas that as you analyze it, it looks like we're going to hold up pretty strong even through the end of the summer, just because there aren't the other crops that are coming in quantity to fill that gap. So we're in an interesting situation here for this in this 2022 grain market heading into 23, and we'll see by the time we get to harvest where we're standing at that time.
With the appropriate amount of volatility sprinkled in amongst all of it. Dan has notes on the markets worth your review. Producers at agmanager.info. He posts those weekly. Check those out. Again, we'll talk next Friday, Dan. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Take care.
Grain market analysis and comment there from Dan O'Brien, grain market economist, K-State Research and Extension, along with this from his office in Colby, northwest Kansas. Just might mention here another regular feature on Ag Manager of interest to you grain producers. Each Thursday, K-State Agricultural Economics posts the latest grain basis maps for Kansas and adjacent states, covering wheat, corn, grain sorghum, and soybeans. Again, those are updated weekly, and you'll find the link to the grain basis maps right there on that front page, agmanager.info. We'll be right back on Agriculture Today. Welcome back. You're listening to Agriculture Today, and these next few moments for you soybean growers who have yet to seed your crop. That's the majority of you. Some thoughts on nutrient management for those soybeans. We've invited by, once again, crop nutrient specialist Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz of K-State Research and Extension to look at starter fertilizer programs for soybeans. And we're narrowing this down to a specific group of nutrients when we talk about this, aren't we, Dorivar?
Yes, Eric. Typically, the nutrients that will show potentially more response in soybean will be phosphorus, potassium, and potentially sulfur, zinc, and boron, which are secondary and micronutrients. But we tend to focus primarily on P and K, specifically for starter fertilizer, but also for fertility management in general in soybean. As we know, soybean is a big user of both phosphorus and potassium.
You need to have an idea of what's out there before you plant. That would be a starting point, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And this is really the key when we think about the decision of adding some starter fertilizers at this point. What kind of salt test levels we have, and do we have the potential to see a response to either P or K in the starter fertilizer or other nutrients for that matter. In the case of soybean in particular, when we talk about starter fertilizers, traditionally we don't think about high probability of response like we tend to see in corn. Corn is just more responsive to that starter fertilizer. The benefit of having some fertilizer early on is planted earlier. And again, we just tend to see much significant response, especially in early growth in the case of corn. That's usually not necessarily the case in soybean. However, the key is, again, here, what is available in the soil, what is the soil test level, and whether or not we see that we will have that probability of response. And yes, in the case of low testing phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients, we have the potential to see significant response in soybean, a response that can translate ultimately to significant yield benefits.
That is on low testing soils. Even average testing soils, can that same claim be made?
Yes, and this is where we need to think about the fertility program overall. And how much nutrients we are putting in the rotation. And what often happens is that we tend to have higher fertility levels to other crops in the rotation, either corn or wheat. And then soybean can be very efficient in terms of using residual fertility. However, if we are slightly low on nutrients because of high yielding and high removal from previous crops, this is one way to essentially complement these nutrients. Even though if soil testing are close to optimum, again, it is one way to complement that fertilizer, and especially to avoid going to the other extreme. And again, thinking about high removal rates for soybeans, especially high yielding soybeans, we can have a significant impact in drops in soil tests if we are not complementing. And so again, in this case, one way to avoid significant drops in soil tests and complement that fertility will be starter fertilizers.
Well, right to the application itself then, and the method of application here is quite important. With relative proximity to the soybean seed?
Yes, and this is one of the key points that we need to keep in mind for soybeans. Soybean seeds are very sensitive to potential damage from fertilizers, and in-furrow application of fertilizer is typically not recommended because of the risk of having some potential damage. And so we need to keep that in mind. And so from that standpoint, essentially we're looking at either a 2x2 application or a dribble on the surface. Those are good options, and obviously we do have flexibility in terms of the rate of application because we are not putting that fertilizer with the seed. And this is one key difference that we need to keep in mind, because in the case of corn, yes, we can do in-furrow application, and that's actually a fairly common practice. But in the case of soybean, because of the sensitive nature of that seedling, we have to be very cautious, and essentially we will not recommend to apply fertilizer in-furrow.
The preference here is to band that fertilizer as opposed to surface applied where that's possible. Is that right?
Yes, and this is one situation that we sometimes become a challenge, especially if we drill that soybean, then perhaps the application as a starter is not possible. And so in this case, broadcast application is definitely an option. And in general, if we're thinking about higher needs for fertilizer application ahead of soybean, the question becomes, are we perhaps too late for fertilizer application, broadcast application at this point? And the answer is no. We can still do that application, and we can see significant benefits, especially if we do need that nutrient as indicated by soil testing. And again, broadcast application typically tends to be done primarily in the fall, winter months. We are getting very close to planting time at this point, but it's definitely possible to do that. We can do broadcast applications of higher rates, and we're seeing good response, especially, again, if that nutrient is needed.
On that point, if one does choose to go ahead and broadcast pre-planting, then do they need to think about the subsequent weather conditions? In other words, would rainfall be important for incorporating that product?
Yes, that's always a key point. However, we have to keep in mind that the nutrient uptake will be happening later in the season. So chances for some incorporation of nutrients like potassium will happen during this growing season, and the plant will see a response. The key here is that obviously these immobile nutrients needs to be applied pre-plant to still allow for time for that movement of that nutrient in the soil. There has been some cases where we have the question of top dress application of immobile nutrients. And in that case, obviously, the potential for response is very low because, again, we are talking about immobile nutrients, like in the case of P and K. If we are considering something like sulfur, which is a mobile nutrient, then obviously we have a higher probability of movement to the root zone and seeing a much better response.
Well, Dorivar, you mentioned the pre-plant broadcast would allow for higher rates, but if one is going to band the phosphorus, potassium, the other nutrients, what rates would they typically be looking at? That will be determined by the soil test, won't it?
Yes, and this will really depend on what's the fertility program that we are using. And again, in some cases, we're simply talking about complementing these nutrients. In that case, obviously, low rate of applications that will be typical for a starter fertilizer. In the case of phosphorus, we're usually talking about less than 20 pounds per acre. However, if we are soil test is indicating that we are deficient, these rates can be increased. And again, with the application of 2x2 or dribble on the surface, we do have the flexibility of putting high rates. And so, again, it really depends on the soil test and the program that we are running.
There's really no worry about, quote, burning the crop with heavier than needed rates, is there?
No, because we are keeping that distance from the seedling. Again, we are not putting any fertilizer with the seed.
Have to ask you this. We are all well aware that soybeans are a legume. They fix their own nitrogen. Are there any situations where a starter nitrogen application, along with the rest, would be appropriate?
This is actually a question that often comes up, especially for high-yielding soybeans, that we need to complement that nitrogen in some way. And quite a bit of research in Kansas shows that the likelihood of seeing a response to any nitrogen application is very low. There are some very few exceptions, and those usually are in situations where we have very sandy soils, very low organic matter, and high-yielding situations. But again, those are the exceptions, and typically it's not something that we will recommend. However, the focus here should be on inoculation if we do have concerns about poor nodulation in some fields.
Main thing, though, is a starter application typically pays off for the soybean producer. Everybody's trying to economize in their crop inputs, but this is one place where they probably shouldn't skip the opportunity.
Absolutely, and we have to keep in mind, again, soybean is a big user of both phosphorus, potassium, and it can show significant response to these nutrients. And so I think there are great opportunities to improve soybean yields. Oftentimes we tend to rely too much on residual fertility for the soybean. However, that potential for response is there, and again, especially as indicated by soil tests, we have to take advantage of that, and starter fertilizer is one excellent way to do it.
The analysis you're looking for will include the 5, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, zinc, and boron. Figure out where you stand with that soil test prior to planting and then adjust accordingly with a starter fertilizer application, as Dorivar has described today. And there is, of course, an article on this in a recent Agronomy E-Update newsletter dated April the 28th. You can find that at agronomy.ksu.edu. Dorivar, thank you, as always.
Thank you.
He's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz, crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. An opportunity here to slip in a quick word about that K-State Soil Health Workshop. It's coming up the week after next, May the 18th and the 19th. That's a Wednesday and Thursday at K-State's Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. A 2-day workshop. It'll be an in-depth look at the principles of soil health, soil management, and carbon credits. And there'll be loads of hands-on experiences conducting field demonstrations and field assessments. This promises to be an outstanding program. It's free of charge. All meals are covered by sponsors, but they'd like you to RSVP no later than the end of next week. The easiest path is to reach out to your local Extension agricultural agent, and they can guide you from there on how to take part in this Soil Health Workshop, May the 18th and the 19th at the K-State Agricultural Research Center at Hayes. We'll be back with more on this Agriculture Today. Coming your way now on this Agriculture Today, the very latest on Kansas agricultural weather. Out of the Weather Data Library here at K-State, here's meteorologist Chip Redmond of K-State Research and Extension. Chip, one would hope anyway that the rains the past week and a half or so have carved away at our drought ratings in Kansas. Noting this would be up to this past Tuesday, what do the numbers tell us?
Yeah, we had drought improvements in places across the state, and we're getting into spring, more convective nature to rainfall, and so we get really wide varying precipitation amounts based upon the heaviest precipitation. So, areas where we saw some improvement were in the Northwest, where they had doubled their weekly average precipitation, and that was before the rain event over the last few days. And then we also saw some improvement in the Northeast and Southeast portions of the state, where we saw some abnormally dry and severe drought reduced.
Mm-hmm. Southwest Kansas, not so lucky, though?
Yeah, Southwest Kansas is a small area of improvement, mainly where the heaviest rains fell in Meade County and also Seward County. They had some heavy rains, 2.5 inches of rain very quickly, where they were able to make some really isolated improvements. Otherwise, the precipitation they received, not enough to meet the weekly average, and continued just a bad scenario for southwest Kansas.
But as you say, other parts of the state had significant to substantial rainfall to the point of some areas now in flood conditions.
Yeah, we saw a big flip, especially in the southeast, where some areas have gotten over 6 inches of rain this week alone. Their weekly average is 1.5 inches, so obviously some big drought improvements to come in the near future, but they're also flooding as a result too. That rain it came slower than a very heavy thunderstorm that parked over them, but unfortunately still too much rain in a short amount of time, and so we've seen several rivers push and approach flood stage.
As per the moisture, what has that done to soil temperatures? Has that held those down to a certain extent?
Yeah, soil temperatures have definitely fallen in the eastern part of the state. Further west, they've fallen just a little bit less. They're a more steady state. But regardless, they're below average across the entire state. And that's kind of been the norm with below normal temperatures that we've seen with these cloudy, overcast conditions the last few days. That helps keep the soil temperature from falling too much and doesn't let us get very cold, but also limits the solar input that we need to warm up those soil temperatures. So we're not accumulating any growing degree units in the soil or above the soil, for that matter, right now.
And the outlook then. There's going to be apparently a rather sharp jump in temperatures come the latter part of the weekend, Chip.
Yeah, the cooler temperatures and increased moisture has kept people out of the field, but we're going to quickly switch that here this weekend. We're going to see temperatures skyrocket to above normal to even near record warmth, especially in the southwest, and that's going to persist really all week next week with temperatures in the 90s to over 100 potentially, and especially in those really dry areas. And we're going to also drop the humidities across most of the region with low humidity and breezy winds and higher temperatures. We start to look at the return of fire weather conditions in the southwest, as well as, we're going to invigor growth across the whole state with vegetation. So we'll see how long it takes for soil moisture to start falling pretty rapidly with that additional growth. It does look dry. We will see thunderstorms slowly enter back into the forecast late next week, mostly isolated in nature, nothing widespread like the precipitation this week, and it'll be mainly focused in the western portions of the state. How much rain reaches the ground and is it beneficial? That's really hard to decipher this far out. Models are not overly aggressive with moisture at this point, though, through the end of next week.
Chip, we always appreciate the input. Thanks. Enjoy your weekend.
Yep, you as well.
He's Chip Redmond, meteorologist, K-State Research and Extension, with the word on Kansas agricultural weather, the latest outlook there. The best to you this weekend likewise, and thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.